A high yogic experience achieved with mescaline. Prior to the experiment described here, I had entertained some doubts as to the claims of Aldous Huxley and others, which imply that mescaline can induce yogic experiences of a high order. The experiment took place on May 25, 1964, Visakha Puja, at my Bangkok house under the supervision of Mr. Jonathan Stoker, who had had previous experience, direct and as an observer, of the effects of mescaline. At 9:50 a.m., I took a half dose, 0.25 grams. For some time, there were no remarkable effects, nothing but a slightly heightened sense of color and form, as exemplified by the vividness of the patterns seen upon my eyelids when I closed my eyes after gazing through the open slats of a Venetian blind. At 10:40, an unpleasant state of mental tension supervened. I found myself involved in a struggle to preserve a hold on my eye, which seemed to be in process of disintegration. This schizophrenic effect was accompanied by a sensation of cold, although the temperature in the room must have been about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and by an increasing lethargy, which discouraged the smallest action. After a while, these unpleasant symptoms abated, and I was able to enjoy attending to what was happening to me. At 11:10 a.m., I took the second half dose, 0.25 grams. Shifting colors and forms danced upon my closed eyelids. Some of these were patterns of great intricacy, such as those which embellish certain parts of sacred buildings, mosques, temples, etc., or sacred objects of various kinds. These elaborate patterns were abstract, floral, etc. Figures of deities, humans, or animals formed no part of them. I recognized each one for what it was: Islamic, Tibetan, Indian, Siamese. But now, for the first time, I saw them not as arbitrary decorations, but as profoundly meaningful. I felt that, in spite of belonging to widely varied traditions, they were all equally valid and all derived from a single source. Presently, I tried to visualize the Tibetan mandala of the peaceful deities, but succeeded only in conjuring up some rather metallic-looking demons, although they were far from frightening and not even very lifelike or realistic, being something of a cross between metal statues and living beings. They did convey to me, as though mockingly, that to expect a profound religious experience as a result of taking mescaline was too presumptuous. Soon after that, the sensation of a rapidly fragmenting personality returned to me with frightening force. I grew alarmed for my sanity, and should have hastened to take an antidote, for the mescaline had one been available. Though Mr. Jonathan Stoker persuaded me to eat some lunch, I was in no condition to enjoy it. By then, things seen and heard presented themselves as independent visual and oral experiences with no seer and hearer to link them into one of those single compositions which, at any given moment, form the content of normal consciousness. The food went down my throat as usual, but it seemed to be disappearing into a receptacle connected with me only to the extent that it was too near to be visible. The mental stress grew agonizing. My fear of permanent madness increased, and I suffered especially from the feeling of having no inner self or center of consciousness into which to retreat from the tension and take rest. An additional discomfort was the sensation of bright lights shining now and then from behind me, as though someone were standing there flicking a flashlight off and on. The movements of my manservant, who came in several times with dishes of food, sweets, and coffee, occasioned great uneasiness. Whenever he was out of sight, I felt he might be standing behind me for some vaguely sinister purpose, and, since he knew nothing of the experiment, I was afraid he would suppose that I was mad. Doubtless anyone else's uninvited presence would have made me equally distrustful and uneasy, though I was not bothered at all by the company of Mr. Jonathan Stoker, because he was in the know, and I felt the need of a nurse or guard. No words can describe the appalling mental torment that continued for well over an hour. All my organs and sensory experiences seemed to be separate units. There was nothing left of me at all, except a sort of disembodied sufferer, conscious of being mad and racked by unprecedented tension. There seemed no hope of being able to escape this torture, certainly for many hours, perhaps forever. Hell itself could hardly be more terrifying. At about 1 p.m., I dragged myself to my bedroom, shut myself away from everyone like a sick animal, and fell on my bed. In my extremity, I suddenly made a total surrender and called upon my Yidam. Come madness or death or anything whatever, I would accept it without reservation if only I could be freed from the tension. For the first time in my life, I ceased to cling to self, loved ones, sanity, madness, life or death. My renunciation of myself and its components was so complete as to constitute an act of unalloyed trust in my Yidam. Within a flash, my state was utterly transformed. From hellish torment, I was plunged into ecstasy, an ecstasy infinitely exceeding anything describable or anything I had imagined from what the world's accomplished mystics have struggled to describe. Suddenly there dawned full awareness of three great truths which I had long accepted intellectually but never, until that moment, experienced as being fully self-evident. Now they had burst upon me, not just as intellectual convictions, but as experiences no less vivid and tangible than are heat and light to a man closely surrounded by a forest fire. 1. There was awareness of undifferentiated unity, embracing the perfect identity of subject and object, of singleness and plurality, of the one and the many. Thus I found myself, if indeed the words I and myself have any meaning in such a context, at once the audience, the actors, and the play. Logically, the one can give birth to the many and the many can merge into the one or be fundamentally but not apparently identical with it. They cannot be in all respects one and many simultaneously. But now logic was transcended. I beheld, and myself was, a whirling mass of brilliant colors and forms which being several colors and several forms, were different from one another, and yet altogether the same at the very moment of being different. I doubt if this statement can be made to seem meaningful at the ordinary level of consciousness. No wonder the mystics of all faiths teach that understanding comes only when logic and intellect are transcended. In any case, this truth, even if at an ordinary level of consciousness it cannot be understood, can, in a higher state of consciousness, be directly experienced as self-evident. Logic also boggles at trying to explain how I could at once perceive and yet be those colors and those forms, how the seer, the seeing and the seen, the feeler, the feeling and the felt could all be one, but, to me, all this was so clearly self-evident as to suggest the words, childishly simple. 2. Simultaneously, there was awareness of unutterable bliss, coupled with the conviction that this was the only real and eternal state of being, all others, including our entire experience in the day-to-day world, being no more than passing dreams. This bliss, I am convinced, awaits all beings when the last vestiges of their selfhood have been destroyed, or, as in this case, temporarily discarded. It was so intense as to make it seem likely that body and mind would be burned up in a flash. Yet, though the state of bliss continued for what I later knew to be 3 or 4 hours, I emerged from it unscathed. 3. At the same time, came awareness of all that is implied by the Buddhist doctrine of dharmas, namely, that all things, whether objects of mental or of sensory perception, are alike devoid of own being, mere transitory combinations of an infinite number of impulses. This was as fully apparent as are the individual bricks to someone staring at an unplastered wall. I actually experienced the momentary rising of each impulse and the thrill of culmination with which it immediately ceased to be. Reality can be viewed as a god dancing with marvelous vigor, playfully, his every movement producing waves of bliss. From time to time, he makes stabbing movements with a curved knife. At every stroke, the bliss becomes intense. I remember that the plunging knife made me cry aloud, "That's it, that's right, yes, yes, yes." Or else reality can be viewed as a whirling mass of light, brilliant color, movement and gaiety, coupled with unutterable bliss. Those who experience it cannot refrain from laughing cries of yes, yes, yes. Ha ha ha, that's how it is. Of course, of course. I felt as though, after many years of anxious search for the answer to some momentous problem, I was suddenly confronted with a solution so wholly satisfying and so entirely simple that I had to burst out laughing. I was conscious of immense joy and of incredulous amazement at my own stupidity in having taken so long to discover the simple truth. A single glimpse of what I saw should be enough to call forth unbounded affection for all living beings. For, however ugly, smelly, or tiresome they may seem, all that is real about them is that gloriously blissful shining consciousness which formed the center of my experience. Hatred, dislike, disdain, aversion for any being sharing that consciousness, that is any being at all, must amount to blasphemy in one who has seen being itself.